Good evening, everyone. My name's Liz Ho. I run the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, which is hosting this forum this evening, in conjunction, of course, with the Water Action Coalition, an organisation that reaches in many directions. It has a number of supporters, supporting organisations, and it's a great pleasure for the Hawke Centre to assist the public discussion of water, our most precious resource. I'd like to begin by welcoming you, not just on behalf of the organisers, but also the University of South Australia. And it is a very important task that I perform, and I do it quite often, to recognise our Kaurna people, the people who belong to this earth, have belonged to this earth for well over 40,000 years, the earth that we stand on here or sit on. And just to tell you that you are in the red kangaroo dreaming part of the Kaurna people's belief, their belief in their country. This is the kangaroo country. And we have a lovely gallery on the third level of the Hawke building, which was assisted by 3 Kaurna elders. And they helped us to develop a number of the aspects of that room. And as you walk in, there's a wonderful message stick with kangaroo feet on it, just to recognise that connection to country. So I would like to thank the Kaurna people on behalf of all of us for the opportunity to meet tonight and to practice, in the words of the elder Lewis O'Brien, Yera, which is the Kaurna word that links most closely to the idea of education as a two-way thinking process. So we're going to have many thoughts tonight. We're going to have different perspectives and different viewpoints, and we're going to be able to hear those collectively, and that is essentially what the Hawke Centre likes to see happening and likes to encourage, so that there is a learning process, there's a thinking process, and then there's an action process. So I thank you all for being here. I ask that you turn off the mobile phones. We are recording this session. It is being video recorded, and there will be access to this session on our website to those who couldn't attend, or if you want to go back and retrieve something that you enjoyed or wanted to know more about as part of tonight's presentation. So thank you very much, and I'm now going to hand over to Richard Watson to introduce the forum and our key speakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction, and thank you for this tremendous facility, and it's good to see such a good turnout. I think we had 210 registrations, and I also obviously acknowledge that we are meeting here on Kaurna land, and I particularly want to acknowledge our key speakers for later in the evening, so thank you for that. One of the things that probably may be helpful is just to begin with just a little bit of background to the WAC institution and how we came about. WAC was formed some 2 years ago, and it comprises a fairly diverse group of interested parties, both community groups, environmental groups, that came together because of the underlying concern in the community 2 years ago about the whole issue of water and the things that were happening in South Australia. I think it may be helpful just to reflect back to what things were like 2 years ago, and we've got a short video which just gives us a graphic illustration of just what things were like, certainly in the Lower Lakes, just 2 years ago.
Woman and man, the history here sun rises and sets, and time stands still with no one around. The beauty of you,
poignant images from the Coorong from just a couple of years ago. They were recorded by Henry Jones. I think some of you would know him, a fourth-generation fisherman who has worked the Coorong for many years, and he wanted to record just how conditions were 2 years ago when things were so bad. But of course, not only was the Coorong dying, there was that sense that Adelaide potentially 2 years ago was going to run out of water. I think it's fair to say that at the time there was a sense of panic. According to the government, I think the view was that desperate times required desperate measures. The Water for Good policy was adopted. Regulators, as you know well, were constructed along the Coorong, and severe water restrictions were also imposed. But I think the most significant thing was that legislation was approved at the time for what I think is now regarded as the biggest capital works program ever undertaken in South Australia, and that of course was to build the desalination plant. The eventual cost is still being debated, but certainly figures of 1.8 billion are regarded as being credible, and with ongoing costs likely to run into millions. I've just got a note here that in just 2 years, when I looked at my water bill, I noticed that it's already certainly doubled, and looking back over 10 years, there's an increase of something like 250%. It's just extraordinary how much the water prices have changed and continue to escalate. But the other thing is just how much has changed, not just water prices. The worst drought on record that we reflected on is now over. The River Murray is as very much has been in flood and is again flowing to the sea. Pelicans are breeding in the Coorong, and Henry Jones is proud of his recent catches, and things have changed. I think at the peak of the flood, something like the amount of water crossing over the border was 100 gigalitres a day. 100 gigalitres a day. That's the output of the desal plant in a full year, and yet that was the figure that was recorded just a month ago flowing over the lake. I mean, of course, the state government says the crisis is over because of the desal plant and stormwater harvesting. I think there's a view that we no longer need to be dependent on nature to have security for our water in the longer term. Yes, much has changed in 2 years. 2 years ago, there certainly was underlying anxiety. 6 months ago or so, we had a debate here with a turnout of so many people concerned about the future of water. So tonight we're going to look just a little bit more closely at the measures that have been taken locally, nationally. We'll analyse the true cost of water reform, and I'm pleased to say we'll begin with an international perspective before we move into a national and then a local perspective. Maud Barlow is the author of Blue Covenant, the Global Water Crisis and the Coming Battle for the Right to Water. She came to South Australia, I think, John, it was about 18 months ago, and certainly was here at a time when there was debate, and she's maintained her interest in what is happening in South Australia. She's the author of 16 books and is on the board of Food and Water Watch and the International Forum on Globalisation. She's currently the national chairperson of the Council of Canadians and chairs the board of the Washington-based Food and Water Watch. She certainly is an authority, and was also a senior advisor, I think, to the 63rd United Nations Forum. So she is a passionate champion of the issue of water, but has taken a particular interest in what's happening in South Australia. So she was keen to come, but circumstances were such that she wasn't able to make it. She's undertaken to come here perhaps in a few months' time. But we've recorded this pre-recorded presentation, and so to begin tonight, an international perspective from Maud Barlow.
Well, hi everybody, it's Maud Barlow from Canada, and I am wishing I were right there with you in person. I'm there in spirit, but I am with you today on this wonderful project and this wonderful gathering to talk about Australia's water, to talk about the world's water, to talk about us as stewards of our water. And real pleased to be here with the Water Action Coalition folks, Ian Douglas and John Caldecott, and all my friends in Australia. And I will be back in person in the near future. John asked me to give a little bit of a background about why it matters. What you're deliberating today matters in our world. And I guess what I wanted to start off by saying was that maybe it wouldn't matter so much if we truly did have all the water that we learned as children that we have. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad if some people were, hoarding it or whatever, because it wouldn't matter. There'd be lots for everybody. But the hard truth is that the lesson we learned back in grade 6, that the world has a finite amount of water and it can't go anywhere and you can't destroy it, is simply not true. I'll tell you about 3 very recent studies that are quite disturbing. One is a study on the world's major rivers that said that 80% of them are severely damaged now, affecting 5 billion people, because we're extracting river water and damming it and polluting it, but we're also growing crops in deserts, or we're moving that water through major cities and dumping it into the ocean as waste when we're finished with it. We're also doing now, and this was the second study, the same to groundwater. We're exponentially pumping groundwater using technology we didn't even have 50 years ago. And another new study found that the use of and extraction of groundwater doubled between the years 1960 and 2000. But now with exponential use, it's probably going to double again in a much shorter time. And they pointed to large bodies of water like the Aral Sea and Lake Chad that are almost gone, that were once absolutely huge, or even to our Great Lakes in Canada that are threatened by overpumping as well. So they made it very clear that this notion that we can depend on these large bodies of water or groundwater forever is simply untrue. The third, that was perhaps the most disturbing, was done by a number of big water-using companies, a number of the bottled water companies included, and coordinated by the World Bank. And they said by 2030, the demand for water in our world will outstrip supply by 40%. Now that's an absolutely stunning statistic if you come to think of it, and if you think of the human suffering that we're going to see as a result. Another new study from the World Health Organization says that in the global south, a child dies of waterborne disease every 3.5 seconds, which is just incredible and just a horrible and totally avoidable tragedy. But often you'll get people who are concerned about the human rights or the development issue not working with or understanding the ecological crisis. So they think it's an issue of money and justice, which it is, but it's also an issue of running out. And we need to build and put together this reality of this double whammy, if you will, of deep injustice and the suffering of so many, including other species, plants and animals, but of a planet running out of water. Now, all that's the backdrop for the discussion that we're having today. And that is, who then, in a world of dwindling water sources, gets to make decisions about who should have access and who should not, how it gets paid for, should it be placed on the open market for sale like running shoes and Coca-Cola, or should it be seen as a collective commons, a public trust and a human right, which you might anticipate is where I stand, of course. So this is the discussion and the debate that we're having. And I guess the thing that I want to say to you so strongly today is that in a world of water scarcity and growing water scarcity, the single worst thing we can do is to let the private sector take over these dwindling, finite, hurt, damaged, fragile sources of water, because it is to their advantage to have polluted water. It is to their advantage to sell more water. Nobody goes into the private business of selling water without the intention of selling more water. I mean, no business could make money unless it does that. You simply, by nature of privatizing water, increase its scarcity. There is simply no way to conserve water, protect source water, and rebuild watersheds and make money from selling it. Those two things are incompatible and cannot go together. The ways in which water is being privatized and commodified, there are, let me count the ways. There are the utilities that deliver water, wastewater and water for drinking water services. The two biggest of these are Veolia and Suez, both in the top 10 corporations in terms of income in the world. They're both from France, and they have subsidiaries all over the place. The World Bank promotes these companies and others in the global south and says, excuse me, well, if you want money for water services, you're going to have to take these private companies, and we're going to make the deal on your behalf, wink, wink, and so it's all private and none of your business public. And of course then for people who can't pay, they get their water cut off, and in many communities now there are prepaid water meters, and for people who can't pay the bills, they just simply get their water turned off. And by the way, in case you think that's only in poor countries in the global south, somewhere in the vicinity, the official number is 45,000, but residents say it's much higher, of families and residences in Detroit, Michigan have had their water cut off because they cannot afford the water rates. And now they're bringing in social services who are taking the children away because there's no water in the home. There's been a private area that twice the size of Great Britain, bought and owned by foreign interests in Africa alone. So this is another form. And then you get the actual water auctioning, like Chile. Chile actually auctions off, has public auctions for its water, and big mining companies, a lot of them from my country, I'm embarrassed to say, come in and they do outbidding of local water sources and local communities and farmers and indigenous peoples and small towns and so on just simply cannot compete, and so they don't have access to water. There's a huge company from Spain that owns most of the water in southern Chile. And then we have what has become very prominent in Australia, in parts of, well, Chile's another country, some of the western states in the US, being introduced into Alberta in my country, although we're fighting it hard. And that is where the country has converted water licenses to property, to tradable market goods, so that you move to trade your water shares. And as you well know, and you'll hear from me and Douglas and others today, that has been a recipe for disaster. It's raised the price of water. It's meant speculators are now coming in and buying up water rights in Australia, telling farmers what to grow. It is, an insidious and very dangerous thing to do, and very hard to get back once you've kind of let it out of the barn. We also have the practice of large companies going into desalination or into fancy chemical recycling, where there's a constant need for dirty water, polluted water to feed this industry. And of course, I think we need to ask the question, who owns that water when it's been recycled? Doesn't that private company, like the bottled water company, own it? So these are all the ways, and there are many more, in which water, piece by piece by piece, is being taken out of the hands of, well, the earth and all the species that need it, and taken out of human a human responsibility and connection, and being taken into the hands of fewer and fewer private corporations who are making a great deal of money on it as if it were, running shoes or cars or whatever. But you know what? Water is the essential element in a living ecosystem, and we've got to stop playing God and moving it around for our pleasure and leisure and convenience and profit. We've got to leave it in the ground. We've got to rebuild watersheds, we've got to conserve, we've got to protect source water, and we've got to see it as a terrible thing to do, to pollute it. Martin Luther King said legislation may not change the heart, but it will restrain the heartless. We have to think generations in front of us, as First Nations people do, 7 generations in front of them. We owe to our future generations the same right to life and the same right to the beauty of this earth that we inherited. And it's not going to happen if it's divided up for the benefit of a wealthy few, while the vast majority go without or even die. So I send love to you from warming up Canada. It's spring here is like winter there in your country, but anyway, it's still, the sun's out. I send love and friendship and solidarity to you, and please fight for water and fight for water justice. Keep water public, take it back into public hands in Australia. It's really, really, really important that you undo the damage that was done in 1993 when that original conversion of those licenses took place. It's never too late to do the right thing. That's a blip in time in terms of future generations, and they'll thank you for it. And I hope to see you all in person very, very soon when I come back to your wonderful country. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure we're going to pass on that applause to Maud when we're next in touch with her, and I know that John will do that. Some extraordinary comments there in the reference certainly to it's time that we need to stop playing God. There's certainly a clear message there. A couple of figures that stand out: the notion that every 3.5 seconds a child dies somewhere in the world because of lack of water, and the fact that in some developed cities, Detroit I think was the reference to the fact that water now is being cut off because people can't afford to pay the bills anymore. An international perspective, and it would be wonderful to see Maud back here. Our next speaker, though, Ian Douglas, is an ardent environmentalist and public water rights advocate, and I know that he's had many conversations with Maud. He is a national coordinator of the Fair Water Use Australia, which is, I must emphasise, is an independent body, and it's certainly politically a non-aligned lobby group, but certainly very active in trying to present the case of water reform. I think it was formed in early 2008 by Australians who share the general concern about what is happening to the way in which water is being presented and harvested. He's also a member of the steering committee of the Water Action Coalition and has been certainly a keen advocate in pursuing the notion in South Australia that we need to address the issue. So, Ian, welcome to the stage, and we look forward to your presentation.
I'd like to particularly thank the Hawke Centre and the Water Action Coalition for arranging this evening. These things just don't happen spontaneously, as we all know. Many of us here this evening will recall when the National Water Reform Agenda was announced following the meeting of the Council of Australian Governments in February 1994. Integral to that process was the establishment of a national water market, which, COAG argued, would direct water to its most productive use. In the years since these changes were announced, the wisdom of applying free market principles to the management of a vital natural resource has been seriously questioned as a result of events overseas, as just mentioned by Maud Bowen. Under the National Water Initiative, Australian governments have made a range of commitments to facilitate the process of reform. But it's surely reasonable to ask why they are applying these radical measures without obtaining prior electoral mandate, and especially in the absence of adequate constitutional protection of water. There are valid concerns that crucial decisions which impact directly on water distribution are now being made by entities whose priority is profit rather than socially and environmentally responsible water use. I'd like to touch on two main areas of concern: water trading and urban water policy. The unbundling of water rights from land title has been a linchpin of water reform. It's enabled water entitlements to be leased, treated as equity, bequeathed, or permanently traded. Australian water is now commoditised, allocated to whoever is willing to pay the going price. In less than 3 years' time, there will be no limit on the volume of water access entitlements that can be permanently traded between connected irrigation districts anywhere in Australia. And the market doesn't care if you intend to use your water for drip irrigation of vegetables, flood irrigation of cotton, for watering golf courses, or merely you wish to hold your allocation as an investment for a rainy day, or perhaps not so rainy day. We're told that trading will promote the allocation of water to high-value uses, but the concept of value is far from precise. The ever-increasing number of corporate agribusinesses may reap high returns from the water they are well positioned to acquire, but to a large extent their profits are internalised, increasingly to overseas interests, minimising benefit to local communities. More traditional farming may result in lower profit at the farm gate, but is believed to have a more marked flow-on effect on local economies. In 2008, water trades totaled more than $2.5 billion, predominantly involving trading of irrigation water. While urban users faced severe water restrictions, water use for irrigated agriculture increased 3% on the previous year, but the gross value of production from irrigation fell. by $358 million. In the same year, following localised inflows into the headwaters of the Darling, but while the vast majority of the basin was still enduring the peak of the worst drought in living memory, the cultivation of cotton and rice consumed almost exactly the same amount of water as that used by Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide combined over the same period, to produce a crop with a combined worth of less than 1.5% of the gross value of agricultural production in that year. Our self-sufficiency in terms of food production also suffered. While the cotton crop trebled, irrigated vegetable production actually fell. Unrestrained exploitation hamstrung the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and its predecessor, the Commission, in its statutory responsibility to manage the basin's water resources in the national interest, and dramatically impaired the inherent ability of the river system to resist the effects of prolonged drought. In the midst of which, as this graph tends to indicate, diversions were maintained artificially while environmental flows plummeted. And for 8 long years, the nation's most vital river was not allowed to flow to the sea. The water market failed to live up to the expectations of the National Water Initiative, driving down water storages in the Murray-Darling Basin to critically low levels at a time when conservation should have been paramount. The consequences for the environment, communities and economy of the basin were all too obvious. In recent months, the rash of resignations from the authority, the distancing of its recently appointed chair and the Federal Water Minister from the guide to the draft basin plan, and the current Senate inquiry into the provisions of the Water Act confirm the resolve of pro-marketeers. Earlier today, Mike Taylor, you may have heard, who resigned as the authority chairman last year, was called in to give evidence to that inquiry in a specially closed session. Why the secrecy? It's believed that around $300 million worth of water licenses are currently in the hands of investors, and we know that amount is steadily increasing. Unlike the majority of traditional farmers, investment companies are typically guided by global market trends, not merely the prevailing cost of Australian water. There are genuine concerns that as more speculators, multinational agribusinesses and financial institutions enter the market, the inherent variability in water prices will be potentiated, particularly during drought, threatening the viability of previously profitable rural businesses and placing more pressure on regional communities. This statement from a large US-based investment company heralded the global move on Australian water, and it's frightening. Summit acquired at least $20 million worth of permanent entitlements to Australian water in 2009, and just last month announced that it is seeking an additional $100 million worth of water rights through its Adelaide-based agent, Blue Sky Water Partners. Last year, Australian-based Causeway Asset Management announced a global drive also to raise $100 million to acquire permanent entitlements to Murray-Darling water, commenting, and I quote, "There is a chronic supply-demand imbalance for Australian water which will result in higher water prices. Owning water entitlements provides investors with direct exposure to water prices." It's clear that these entities are targeting the high returns to be made under leaseback arrangements during periods of water scarcity. Otherwise, why would they be there? And water scarcity is an all too regular occurrence in this country. And it's really hard to see the fundamental national benefit of exposing our water to such activity. In a statement on urban water policy released last month, the chair of the National Water Commission, the statutory body responsible for driving the process of water reform, urged further deregulation and the construction of more desalination plants and dams. It's in writing, she said that. But tellingly, she made no mention of initiatives to reduce consumption in a country which, in 2004, was rated as the third largest per capita user of water in the world. This commitment to unrestrained growth is being used to justify public-private partnerships and the construction of ill-conceived and untenably costly water infrastructure, most notoriously desalination plants. Australians continue to be massaged into accepting this high-tech but inefficient and environmentally toxic industry, governments insisting that desal is necessary to ensure our water security, whilst largely ignoring the potential of greener, and more efficient alternatives. The Productivity Commission itself recently criticised the move towards desal plants on economic grounds alone, irrespective of the environmental costs. When first announced in 2007, Victoria's desal plant was costed at $3.1 billion, and Victorians are now informed that they face a total bill of close to $20 billion over the next 30 years, even if the plant is not required to operate. The South Australian experience is all too similar. In attempts to stave off persistent criticism of white elephant infrastructure, it's probable that conservation of urban water supplies will continue to be a low government priority, other than during periods of prolonged and severe drought. Last year, South Australian Water Minister Paul Hawke was quoted as stating, "I've always said that we will continue lifting the restrictions when the desal plant comes online." And our governments appear quite comfortable entering into public-private partnerships with multinationals whose track record in terms of corporate responsibility on the global stage is at best inglorious. Nationwide, the corporatisation of water utilities has resulted in price hikes and an accent on fixed rather than consumption-based charging, leading to concerted public protests such as those currently taking place in southeast Queensland, amid fears that corporatisation is a precursor to privatisation. To date, South Australia is the only state to have dabbled with privatisation of water supplies, and Adelaide consumers have already been paying the price. Last year, the state government announced that it would not be renewing its contract with United Water, a wholly owned subsidiary of Paris-based colossus Veolia Environment, due to allegations of overcharging to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. Nonetheless, publications such as that released by Deloitte in March last year seem to be priming Australians for the progressive sell-off of public water utilities. In 2007, the value of state-owned water assets was estimated at $70 billion, clearly a major temptation in the lap of state governments seeking to balance their budgets. And when the floodgates do open, you may be sure that there will be no dearth of interest from the global investment community. In closing, the path that's been taken since 1994 has been indeed strangely strange. The stated aim of water reform is to implement a strategic framework to achieve an efficient and sustainable water industry, but on whose terms and to whose benefit? Despite the fact that polling has indicated that at least 70% of Australians are opposed to it, water privatisation is being imposed upon us under the guise of water reform, as a result of a closed-door agreement made nearly 20 years ago. Many of us believe that water reform as it stands is a recipe for disaster, promoting outcomes that are socially and environmentally irresponsible. Water reform needn't and shouldn't equate to privatisation, a process largely incompatible with the protection of water as a public good. Australians surely have the right to indicate which path we wish to follow, via state-by-state plebiscite, if necessary. Free trade agreements, which have laid out the welcome mat to overseas speculators, should be renegotiated or scrapped, at least insofar as they apply to natural resources. This is consistent with data released by the Productivity Commission last month, which indicates that free trade agreements have led to only small increases in national income. Socially responsible water reform cannot proceed in the absence of sound legislated protection of water as a common good. In 2009, the High Court of Australia found that there was a common law notion that water, like light and air, is common property, not especially amenable to private ownership, and best vested in a sovereign state. First drafted over a century ago, our Constitution does not refer to water rights other than related in very general terms to navigation, conservation and irrigation. Section 100 requires amendment if water is to be adequately protected in the 21st century and beyond. Irrespective of whether the 1994 vintage of COAG had a full understanding of the implications of its decision, sincere governments would now admit that water reform is privatising an all too finite and easily abused natural resource and poses a serious threat to Australia's water future. Thank you.
certainly some provocative material there, and I think there are some figures that haven't been used before. There'll be a chance to ask Ian some questions later, but a couple of things I picked up. Ian, was it correct you said that the cotton farming industry in Australia consumes the total amount of the equivalent of Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide in that particular year? All right. And I did a quick calculation of your desal figures, and I think I came to a figure of just over 10 billion for constructions across Australia at the moment. Our next presenter has had certainly a lifelong interest in the marine environment, especially with our Gulfs and Kangaroo Island. I think he's been interested in the area since the early 70s. In December, though, in 2009, John Caldecott was elected President of Friends of Gulf St Vincent, and he certainly has been involved with many other community organisations. But most recently, he has been the driving force behind the Water Action Coalition. When we came together 2 years ago, John was certainly there advocating for it, and now the group has a membership of something like 26 or 27 different organisations and a reference group, and many are here tonight. So John was there at the beginning of the movement and is still certainly championing the cause today. So I'm pleased to introduce the convener of the Water Action Coalition to lift the lid, something that John has been keen to do for some time, on the consequences of water reform, and to follow up on the presentation that Ian's just given.
I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you all for coming, and also particularly the Hawke Centre, because we wouldn't be able to hold this function without their support. 20 years of water reform failed South Australia when it counted the most during our severe drought. The High Court stated in December 2009, the second point of interest is that the language of the 1896 Act and the 1912 Act does not disturb the common law notion that water, like light, like air, is common property, not especially amenable to private ownership and best vested in a sovereign state. 1.6 million South Australians are being dispossessed of their human and common right to water by water reform. During the drought, both the Howard and Rudd governments failed to prevent the disaster in South Australia. The Rand government went along with the flow. In 2007, flows to South Australia fell significantly below our minimum entitlement of 1850 gigalitres. Calls for a state of emergency by the advertiser in July 2008 went unheeded. Private economic interests are being put before the common good. As a consequence, the government has lost its mojo. Fragile environments continue to be put at risk by desalination plants, stormwater, wastewater, marinas and deep water ports. According to Peter Ralph of UTS, seagrass meadows, mangroves and salt marshes have recently been identified as some of the densest carbon sinks by area. They store 5 to 10 times the carbon held in tropical forests, and they hang on to this carbon for very long periods of time. The extent of groundwater pollution in this state is outrageous. There are 65 major storages and 600,000 private dams in the basin. They are capable of diverting 1.5 times the average flow of every river. In addition, there are 25,560 kilometres of irrigation, supply and drainage channels. Total public storage capacity is 22,664 gigalitres. If an Olympic-sized swimming pool was this volume, the Adelaide desal plant would be a very expensive 11,000 litre rainwater tank. Dams were established to drought-proof or rain-proof the basin. These storages currently hold 82% or 18,318 gigalitres. In 2004-05, households' consumption from the basin was 2%. Industry 1% and agriculture 96%, including losses. Diversions from the basin increased 331% from 1950s to 2000. It is also clear the Interstate Royal Commission of 1902 served South Australia well for most of the last century until economic rationalism arrived. The minimum entitlement of 1850 gigalitres maintains water level from the border to the barrages. It is critical. Included in that figure is a diversion cap of 805 gigalitres. The cap was a result of the 67-68 drought. Former Minister May will increase the cap for irrigation by 76 gigalitres in 2008. The same year, the 50 gigalitre Adelaide desalination plant was announced. The average outflow of 5,100 gigalitres is what should be happening under current water sharing arrangements. This needs to become a regulated outflow. The cap in South Australia for urban water is 180 gigalitres and 554 gigalitres for irrigation. The majority of water is piped. The scale of the efficiency of water use is unmatched by the eastern states. The cap is also a barrier to water trade. The Basin Guide makes no commitment to its continuance. South Australia's long-standing conservative approach to water management is at significant risk from water reform. In 1989, the Bannon Labor government agreed to reduce the storage reserve designed to safeguard South Australia's minimum entitlement. This reserve was reduced from 2,500 gigalitres to just 850 to allow upstream states to use more water and supposedly guarantee our water supply. Carryover allowed upstream irrigators to keep unused water allocations. This turned public water storages into private water banks, and here we are as the late 80s. Privatisation of water is taking place by unbundling water licences from land to allow their trade by state water allocation plans. These plans are subject to the approval of the Minister for Water and become statutory documents. Severe droughts and major floods are routine in the basin. It is not climate change but climate variability. Inflows can range from a few thousand to 40,000 gigalitres. They began to trend down in 1996. Post-2000, the average inflow was 3,900 gigalitres. Designing consumption around long-term averages misrepresents the true picture. Above average flows occurs only 34% of the time because major flood events create significant bias in the statistic and should not be used. Since the 1990s, the trend of inflows to South Australia began to trend dramatically down. First to go was the unregulated flows through the Murray Mouth. By 2003, all that was left was South Australia's minimum entitlement, the blue line at the bottom of the graph. The flows below 1850 gigalitres, below the red line, caused South Australia's crisis. They were used to justify the interventions in the River Murray and the 100 gigalitre Adelaide desalination plant. The average flow during this decade, incidentally, was 210 gigalitres, which, if it had been carefully managed, we may have survived without any of those interventions. The bar graph of discharge through the barrages illustrates the impact of bias in water sharing plans versus the environment, and these are state water sharing plans. This bias has been in place since 1895. Water reform hasn't touched it. The river's share of water can fall to 20% during severe droughts and rise to 80% during major floods. Significant problems are created when there are persistent years of low flows, as occurred during the drought. This is not the fault of irrigators, but the fault of governments. Between 2000 and 2007, significant draining of basin storages took place. Public storages went from a record high of 13,900 gigalitres in 2000 to a record low of 500 gigalitres by 2007. Quoting from a May 2006 New South Wales government document, typically New South Wales makes as much water available to licensed water users in any year as is available to the state within the limits of the Murray-Darling Basin cap. This maximises water use in any one year, but means that New South Wales maintains minimum water reserves for the next year. This is a deliberate policy of New South Wales that ensures that it is the decision of the individual user whether to use water or not to use the water they are entitled to. Trade the water or save some to carry over into the following season. Given the scale of basin-wide diversions, and you can see there in 97-98 they're around 12,000 gigalitres, it's clear the reduction of inflows which began in 1997 were ignored. South Australia's share of diversions is the yellow bar at the bottom of the graph. Total surface water diversions between 1997 and 2009 totalled 104,680 gigalitres. Our share was 6%. Just 1.7% of this water would have prevented South Australia's disaster. Urban users were put on water restrictions. Irrigation allocations were cut, but there was no restrictions on what they could use their water for. The failure and consequences for South Australia were spectacular and exceed the State Bank disaster in terms of the total economic, environmental damage and social costs. Murrumbidgee irrigators were allowed to borrow 795 gigalitres from the Snowy. Diversions for cotton, rice, cereals and pasture amounted to 11,766 gigalitres in 2004 to 2006. During the depths of the drought, the highest average price for temporary water in 08-09 was 37 cents per kilolitre. 100 gigalitres of temporary water would have cost South Australia 37 million. It is now worth 2 cents per kilolitre, but government should not have to buy water. 100 gigalitres of permanent high reliability water would have cost 310 million. What government in their right mind would build a 100 gigalitre desalination plant at a cost of 1.8 billion with operating costs of $200 million per year when water was available from the basin? In 05-06, 18,634 irrigation businesses used 7,369 gigalitres of basin water. The gross value of their production averaged 75 cents per kilolitre water used. Those who used the most water earned the least. Almost the entire Australian cotton crop is exported as virtual water with little local value adding. Irrigation is a poor cousin when compared to the economic efficiencies of other industries and Australian households. In 05-06, Australian median household earnings per kilolitre of water used was $221 per kilolitre. The consequences of not using water from the basin makes neither economic or environmental sense when the alternatives are desalination plants. The water for BHP Billington's Roxby Downs project should come from the basin or by piping recycled waste and stormwater from Adelaide. Tradable water entitlements on issue 16,200 gigalitres were originally granted for free by state governments. South Australia holds just 6% of these because it capped diversions in 67-68. During the drought, diversions ranged from 12,123 gigalitres in 2001 to a record low of 4,119 gigalitres in 08-09. Clearly, significant quantities of these entitlements are worthless and need to be cancelled by the states. A significant amount of the water being purchased by the Commonwealth is common water vapour. This is a picture of a broadacre farm being converted to grapevines on the Gummersall Road, Tanunda, in 2008. What government in their right mind will allow the conversion of a viable, dry, broadacre farm into irrigated vineyards during one of the most protracted droughts in our history? Conclusions. 07-08, the National Water Commission, I might say, proudly released its first National Water Market Report. 1,231 gigalitres of temporary water was traded across the Southern Basin. In 08-09, this grew to 1,883 gigalitres. Despite the severe drought, water was available in the basin. The Commonwealth failed to call a state of emergency to prevent South Australia's disaster. Instead, they left us to the mercy of the water market. Their water reforms cannot be trusted. South Australia's decades of water conservation should be copied and not destroyed, and we deserve more water, not less. The basin plan needs to be designed around droughts and not floods. Key recommendations. South Australians need to know where our politicians stand on upholding the public's trust that water remains their common property. A referendum must be held to approve the privatisation of water. The Draft Water Industry Act is more Commonwealth water reform. Its objective is to further break up water supply and services to create a private water industry. While SA Water remains a corporation, it will be privatised. Water reform's market principles are being applied to all prescribed water regions of the state through water allocation plans. Only a South Australian Drought and Water Commission of Inquiry will be able to unravel the decades of bad policy and gross mismanagement of water and its consequences without political and market interference. Both Sir Thomas Playford and Don Dunstan would have acted by now. Lastly, it is time to focus on saving our gulfs from stormwater, wastewater, desalination brine and unsuitable development. Our seagrass beds are hidden carbon treasures. Thank you.